Hello guys, today we're going to be building another model base. Specifically, we're looking at this tropical island runway base I've made. Now it's a little strange to have an armor subject on a runway, but the techniques we'll be using today are applicable to any similar subject. It's just things like basic groundwork, grass, asphalt, just paint a road marking, not a runway marking on that, and you're set. I think making a base for your model is always a good idea. It makes it easier to transport, looks better in person at shows, and it also can provide some context to the vehicle if it has any unique weathering or camouflage patterns, for example. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and now let's get started on this tutorial. To begin, I made a quick sketch here. I want the runway with some obvious markings, and then we're gonna have a sloping terrain in the corner. My base here is a simple gallery board that's very cheap at the local art store and very lightweight. Now I want to have a flat surface for the runway, so I glued on a cut piece of wood here. You can use cork for typical asphalt, but I want this thing to be really, really flat. And of course, I clamped it and glued it with some wood glue. Next, I cut this wedge of normal insulation foam. It's gray instead of pink, but it's the same stuff you typically use here. I'm being pretty rough here, just shaping it. You can use a hot knife or hot wire cutter, but this is sufficient for a small piece. I found that matte medium works well for gluing the foam to the wood. It's very secure. And I want to make these edges look much more presentable. So for that, I'm going to put some balsa wood sheets for the edges. You can see the kind of stuff I'm using here. Super cheap stuff at the local hobby store. And you can cut this very easily with a hobby knife. I also glue this in place with the same wood glue I used for the main panel. In any places where there were some gaps where the panels met up, I simply filled this with some wall filling compound I had on hand and sanded it smooth. And with that, we've achieved a very durable and lightweight base that we can start putting our scenery on. Now this whole method is pioneered by Mr. Hamilcar Barkas, one of my good modeling friends. I'll link his channel in the upper corner for you guys. And here's an example of another base I've made with a similar technique, but of course no runway, just all terrain. Now I want to make a little retaining wall in the corner, so I've got some evergreen board and batten styrene sheet, and I'm going to cut this to shape. Evergreen styrene makes a whole bunch of different textures that are very useful for walls and roofs and everything like that. If you're making a building, much easier than making it yourself, and it's usually pretty cheap. So you can see I've cut and sanded that to fit perfectly in my little gap here. Now for all the runway textures, I'm going to use this AK Terrain asphalt paste. This is actually a really good product. So I want to have some concrete slabs, and then I also want to have the runway surface itself. To define these, I'm going to first mask off and put the concrete area in first. That'll make sure I have a nice gap. This stuff almost looks like soft serve ice cream. Don't try eating it though. And it's actually very easy to work with. You just kind of spoon it on, and I'm using a little spatula here to apply it and then smooth it out. You have a few hours before this dries fully, and you can also adjust it with a wet finger or anything like that. But in this case, I just used the spatula to smooth it out, and that worked very well. Once the previous area had dried, I then masked that and started applying all the asphalt for the main runway itself. Now there was a bit of an issue here in that this surface was so big that I couldn't smooth it out properly because my spatula just isn't nearly big enough. You need a big, huge cake icing spatula. So I applied one coat, let it dry, and then I decided to try to apply a second thin coat to smooth it out. And this gave me a bit of a happy accident result. When applying the second coat, I noticed that my spatula would kind of skip up and down due to the rough asphalt texture of the previous layer. The skipping would create this perpendicular ridge texture to the runway, which is something that they have in real life. These grooves are there to allow water to disperse so that planes don't hydroplane, essentially. This basically happened by accident, but I was very happy that I didn't have to scribe all those lines in myself. with a ruler and a knife. The AK asphalt paste is way too black to look realistic even for fresh asphalt, so I'm going to use a few different Tamiya colors here, and we're going to airbrush this to a proper color. For the runway itself, I mixed up mostly Tamiya XF80 with a little bit of German gray in there. And then for the concrete areas, I did the same thing but with deck tan instead of the light gray color. And of course, I wanted to make this obvious that this was a runway, so I'm going to mask and airbrush some runway markings. Now, if you do the math here and extrapolate the width of this runway, it is way too narrow based on the spacing of my markings here. But sometimes when it comes to making a diorama like this, you really have to compress things just to be able to tell the story properly. Otherwise, this would not be very clear that it's a runway. It's a compromise, basically. In a couple of places, some of the AK asphalt texture itself broke apart and lifted up with the tape, but we'll just turn that into weathering. For the texture here on the ground, I was originally planning on using this AK texture paste as well, which I assumed would be just like the asphalt, a thick texture paste. However, it seems like these smaller jars are meant for vehicle weathering, not diorama making, because they're way too thin. So I simply added a bunch of dirt to the paste to thicken it up. And again, I applied this with my little spatula palette knife. As an acrylic, you can smooth out any areas that are too bumpy with a little bit of water and a paintbrush. Now, to improve the texture even more, I sprinkled on a little bit of the dirt while the AK texture paste was still wet. This way it would simply stick on its own. So I'm using a thicker dirt up here on the soil, and I used a much finer dirt on the beach area here where I want it to look like sand. Once that had dried, I now airbrushed this to get a more unified color. I started with XF72 Japan Ground Self-Defense Forest Brown for the soil areas. And then I used XF93, one of the new Tamiya Tropin colors, for the sandy areas. And I also worked this a little bit over the runway itself. And lastly, wooden deck tan was used to lighten up some areas where I wanted the sand to look more like beach sand. When making a base like this, it's important that the model and the base look cohesive. You want them to have a similar level of contrast and the same colors of earth and dust, for example. And I found that I needed more contrast on the base, so I'm essentially going to start almost weathering it. First up, I used the MIG Productions Dark Wash to darken up the soil areas so that they would look more in line with what's on the vehicle itself. This also made the soil look more rich, and after I put the foliage on top later, this was an appropriate level of shadow. On the runway surface, I now used a very dark gray oil paint, 502 Abteilung smoke color. And my goal here is to make the appearance of the tire marks from landing aircraft. So I'm applying a thick wash, and then I can blend out the edges with some enamel odorless thinner. Now, in the more likely event that you're making a road and not a runway, you can use similar but more subtle effects to create the appearance of accumulated oil or grime from passing vehicles and dust and dirt towards the edges of the road where it accumulates. I also applied the same wash we used earlier onto the seawall and also around those concrete slabs. Any excess was also wiped away with enamel odorless thinner. And there we go. Now we have a suitable level of contrast on the base that matches nicely with what we have on the vehicle. So now things look more cohesive and unified, and it seems like the model properly fits on the scene. Next up, we're going to apply some foliage. I have a few different types of grass tufts here, and also some laser cut leaves. These are from a company called Gamer's Grass. They are laser cut paper with printing on both sides, and they look very nice, but you do have to put in some work to make them not obviously paper as they look right out of the box. So I used some soft tweezers here as to not damage them, and I carefully bent and rolled the leaves to some degree to make them look more natural, and I think they look pretty nice, but there is an obvious paper white edge along both sides, so I had to lightly paint that with some green paint. I stacked up a few different layers and sizes of these leaves to make the plants look more full, and I also gave them a coat of matte varnish to get rid of that shine. I glued these in place using super glue, and you can see we already have tufts glued in place. Those are the ones I showed you before from AK. I was so pleased with the laser cut leaves, I went to my hobby store and bought another type because I wanted more tropical leaves. I shaped and rolled and modified these by hand as I did the previous ones, and I made sure to once again paint those edges with a little bit of green paint to make them not look like paper. Also note a few areas where I've put some sticks and rocks in the ground to make it look more natural. These laser cut leaves were really what sold this as tropical island terrain. Even with such a small piece, I think it's obvious what I'm trying to represent. Now, to really sell the airfield, I essentially kit bashed these lights from random parts I found online, and I've painted them based on some reference photos to look like runway landing lights essentially. I attempted to do some shading here to make them look like a lens. I didn't do a great job, so go find some wargaming channel on how to do this light effect properly. After painting, I wanted to make it look like there was an actual clear plastic lens over top of the light, and I achieved that by building up 3 consecutive layers of brush applied gloss varnish, and that beefed it up and made it look like an actual lens. And for the final step, to make our base look nice and professional and presentable, it's important to paint the edges. Now you can use black like I prefer, or you can use brown or green or any other color of your choosing. You could even just stain the wood itself. And here is the result of my unsinkable aircraft carrier base. Essentially what I'm modeling here are those occupied islands in the South China Sea where generally China turns uninhabited rocks into air bases to expand their territory. I think the leaves really sell this as a tropical island, and importantly, we've achieved unity between the colors of the base and the vehicle. So for example, similar colors of earth, similar colors on that seawall and the tracks, and I succeeded in making this obviously a runway with the lights and the markings and the tire marks. Again, I should have probably made the tire marks a little bit longer, but when you put the tank on there, you don't really notice that they're way too short. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you picked up some tips and tricks, and I hope you are inspired to make a base for your next model. As I said at the beginning, this is a great way to make your model more presentable and just easier to transport to shows. If you have any questions or comments, post them on below. I always read through them all. And if you like my work, you can support me for just $1 a month on Patreon. That really helps me making these videos. As always, I'll see you guys next time. Until then, stay safe and happy modeling. See ya.